Hi all. Today we have to discuss another new feature of the Spring Boot. There is integration with Spring Data. How to integrate with Spring Data uh, through minimal configuration using Spring Boot. We have to see and we have to do few hands-ons. Will not go in depth on the Spring Data. So we'll have different video to work with Spring Data. This video will consider that we have the basic knowledge on Spring Data and how to integrate that Spring Data with our Spring Boot framework. First, we have to see that how to add the dependency with Spring Data. As we know that Spring framework itself has given lots of inbuilt functionality to interact with the database. So we can interact with the database directly using JDBC driver, JDBC concept, or we can use the object relational mapping or ORM concept to interact with the database. And Spring uses the Hibernate as a ORM provider. But other than uh, this JDBC and ORM, Spring Boot has given another flavor, that is Spring Data, which is nothing but uh, kind of a another layer which is giving that uh, repository concept to interact with the database. Means that we have to give the repository name, we have to develop our repository interface, we have to provide the method name, and based on the method name, Spring Data will derive that corresponding query and interact with the database. So as a developer point of view, this is another layer of abstraction on ORM. So I don't need to interact with the ORM also directly. I have to tell to ORM framework, hey, I need the all employee, or I need to delete this employee. So that ORM framework will generate the query and also interact with the database. So this is a very easy way to interact with the database, but I'm not going in depth on the Spring Data. So we'll have another video on the Spring Data. uh, Now how to add the dependency. This is the corresponding dependency, that is group ID, and that is the artifact ID. This is a starter. JPA starter needs to be added. So once we have to add this JPA starter, the Spring Boot will download the corresponding dependent file. Now next what we have to do, we have to, once the JPA starter is there, next thing is that which database I have to use. We have to first we have to see how to connect with the embedded database. So what does it mean, the embedded database? Embedded database is a kind of in-memory database. So Spring Boot has given already some inbuilt uh, three types of embedded database, that is HT, HSQL and Darby. So once that project point of view, if you think that okay, I need the in-memory database, then the advantage and disadvantage is that in embedded database, the performance wise it is very good. So it is not some external connection, but the problem is that data will be lost once the server will crash or server will be stopped. So we need to think about that, the once you have to use the in embedded database, how the data will feed into that corresponding embedded database. So that we need to think about that once you have to use the embedded database. But here in this video you have to see how to use the embedded database. So once we have to use the embedded database, we don't need to provide the corresponding data source configuration URL or data source credential. This is auto configured. Spring Boot, we have to just plug in into that corresponding dependency in our pom.xml and then start to use that corresponding entity and repository. That's all. So I don't need to think about that, what is that URL, what is the user ID, what is the password. So all things will be auto configured by Spring Boot. So here the example, if we need to think about that HSQL DB we have to use as an embedded database, we need to simply add the corresponding. We have to do now one small hands-on on embedded database integration with our Spring Boot application. So this is one simple Spring Boot application. If we see our application, we have that one controller. What we have? We have one controller class, we have entity, we have repository, and we have service. First, if we go to our pom.xml, if we see our pom.xml, first what we have done, we have this corresponding dependency. These are the two dependencies are required to start working with that HSQL embedded database. First one is required, that is that Spring Boot starter JPA, that is required to work with Spring data. But top of that, if we want to work with embedded database, and we need to select which embedded database we need to integrate. Let's say for this example, we have selected HSQL and that dependency has been added. So if you think that to integrate with H2 or Derby, then we can add that corresponding dependency. So this is the first thing we need to do in our pom.xml. Second, what we have done here in our controller class, we have three simple methods. We have get employee details, which is taking ID to give that employee details. We have that populate employee, means that to populate the employee database very initially. And third is that to create that corresponding employee with some specific data top of that population. Now if we go to our repository, that repository is a Spring Data standard. So this is a simple repository. We have not added any customized method. So this is a simple method which we are inheriting from that parent class. If we go to our CRUD repository interface, see this interface is exposing that basic method. Save method is to save that entity in our database. To save all means the list of entities, and find by ID, find by existing by ID, find all. So all are the basic methods are already there. Top of that, if we think to add some methods, then we can always add into our repository. So we'll not go into that level to implement that, enhance that repository. We'll see that how that embedded database works with a Spring Boot application. So now here we have added that employee service. If we see this employee service, we have some static population just to populate the database. In real project, we can populate the database from some external database. Let's say to take the value from the some external feed, and we can populate our initial database. Because embedded database performance wise, this is a very good. So as this is a in-memory database, so it will always give the best result. But the problem is that once the application is shut down, that corresponding data will be lost. So that database will start from very zero. Once unless and until we populate the value from the external feed, so that is why always it starts from very beginning. So here, just to populate the database, we have taken some 4 basic employee entity, that is a 4 employee value. And once if we see our populate employee, what it is doing, it is simply iterating the employee map and saving the value, and create employee taking the value and using the same method. So now if we check that corresponding populate employee first, sorry, yeah, here in our corresponding postman, if we see our postman method, if we just, what we will do, first we have to populate that run that method. Let's send it. Could not send the request. Why? If we see, it is 8080 populate. Oh, sorry, the application has not started till now. What we can do, we can enhance little bit this application, try catch, we can see, let's say, catch exception, and we can say sorry, this is for the service method. I don't want to enhance in the service method. So what we can do in our controller class, simply here we can try catch here. Yes, catch exception. Yeah, here let's say we can return exception to string. Here we can say this return employee details are created successfully. Yeah, you can just return the string. Yeah, here also you can enhance that create employee also. Yeah, you can do it quickly. Yeah, we can check that whether this value is with there or not. Let's say employee. Yeah, here we can see this also string employee. Let's say we can enhance this employee dot get name. Right. Yeah, now let's start this application. Employee application run as, yeah, till the server is running. If we see the console, yeah, so few things we need to observe. This is a starting first the Hikari pool. What is this? This is the connection pool to connect with the database. So this is required whether if we connect with the embedded database or actual production database, that corresponding external database. So first we need that connection pool. Here Spring Boot uses by default the Hikari pool, but we have to see later that how we can change this data source or connection pool configuration. So the default configuration is the Hikari pool, and what is the, as we are saying always that the Spring Data is top of that ORM framework, so we need one ORM provider. So Spring Boot has the default provider as a Hibernate. So Spring Boot is using Hibernate as a provider and Hikari pool as a default data source configuration. Now we have to test this application. Now if we go to our Postman, now this is the populate employee, and if we send this application, see employee details are created successfully. Now if we see our get employee details, and if we see that corresponding 1001 started, because if we go back to our application and if we see our initial map, yeah, this has started from 1001 1002. So now if we go to our 1001, see this is a Tom. If we see this is a 2, see this is a Tom. Now we have to create one new employee top of this database. So now if we go to our create employee, and if we add this, let's say this one, and this is a, let's say giving the name, let's say new employee. Now ID I am saying 1010. Now if we see employee, new employee details are created successfully. Now to check that whether it has really added in our embedded database or not, we can always go back to get employee details and check with 1010. Yeah, see this new employee has been is there. So now this is the, if we see our service class, see this is a simple creating one employee and populating and get. But if we need to know all the employee details, we can always develop one another method. Let's say we can do one thing. if we say get all employee, and here what we can do, it will return that, sorry, yeah, it will return that list of employee, right? List of employee. Now if we see this find all, we have one method find all, right? Now see, this is, I think this we need to convert it somehow. Okay, yeah. Okay, now this is returning employee, and in a controller we have to publish one. So what the error here? Okay, okay, so this method needs to be a list of employees, so we can do in quickly one thing, we can populate this employee. Empl list equal to new array list, and we can run that for each loop, for each employee, that is that corresponding find all. So we can definitely improve this method, but for the moment I am just checking the find all method, how we can add it. So add the employee. Yeah, now we can do it and return empl list. What is happening? Yeah. So now service is there, so we can expose this method in the get employee. So we can simply copy paste, and we can get employee list, get all employee, let's say we don't need to pass the id, get employee list. Yeah, I don't need to pass anything here, and here I'll see this get all employees, sorry, yeah, get all employees. Yeah, what is happening? This I cannot convert list, oh sorry, list to employee. Now if we see our console, yeah, this has been loaded, but let's see that whether all value are there or not. First we need to check 1010 value was there. Now what is happening for the 1010 now? See, this is coming as a null because we have created this application. Once we have added it and we have changed the application, and server has been restarted and the database is lost, data is lost. So now if we do one thing, first what we will do, we have to first create one add request, let's say that is the get all employee. Is it there? No, sorry, get all employee. Okay, now we can first check that what are the employees are there. Get all 0, yeah, get all employee. See, there is no employee. So what we have to do, first we have to populate the database. So now we have to first populate the database. Employee details are created successfully. Now we have to check the get all employee. See, all values are there, 1001, 1002, 3 and 4. Now we have top of this, we have to add the data value. Now we are adding the 1010. Send it, are created successfully. Now if we say get all employee, let's see that all employee has been added or not. Yes, this has been added. So this is the way we can enhance our application on top of our embedded database. So this I wanted to show you that how we can use that embedded database with our Spring Data, but we should keep in mind in the design point of view whether really we need to use that embedded database in your project or not. But if required, then we can easily integrate the embedded database with Spring Boot with a very less configuration, and I don't need to bother about the database details because all have been auto configured by the Spring Boot. This is the good thing we should keep in mind. So now in this next slide we have to see that how to check with the how to integrate with our corresponding embedded database. So the how to integrate with our MySQL. This is our embedded database, but we can check that how to integrate with the MySQL, because once we have to integrate with the MySQL, we need to check that okay, what is the database, what is the URL, all things are required. So now we have to do one thing, we have to stop this application now. Yeah, if we see, if we terminate this application and simply again if we run this application, what will happen, it will, we will see that nothing is there. Yeah, application is starting. Yeah, now if we see our dialog, now if we see our get employee, it should give the nothing. Yeah, okay, so that's all for the hands-on on the embedded database, and we will now see that how to integrate with the MySQL in the next slide. Now we have to see the connection with the MySQL in our Spring Boot application. So if we see that corresponding the configuration in this slide, only few things I need to configure in my application, and Spring Boot will do remaining all other things to connect with the database. What I need to provide? First, I need to provide to the Spring Boot what is the connector, because Spring Boot to connect with the database we need some driver, right? So here we need to provide the Spring Boot that okay, what is the driver to connect with the with my MySQL database. So here we have provided that corresponding group ID and artifact ID. This is the MySQL connector Java. So this is the connector or driver class will be loaded in our Spring Boot application based on the dependency. So this is the like the JDBC we need one driver. Here also MySQL we need one driver that has been provided through the dependency. So next thing is the remaining, that what is my database. So that things we need to do through our property file. We need to provide that corresponding database URL, username, password, the credential details. So once we have to provide that corresponding credential and the URL details with top of that corresponding connector, Spring Boot will try to reach to that corresponding database based on that connector whatever we have provided. Now let's think about, now we have provided the embedded database dependency as well as we have provided that MySQL dependency. But as long as we have provided that corresponding property file, Spring Boot will not means that if we provide that configuration in our application.properties, Spring Boot will try to connect through the MySQL. But if we do not provide that application.properties, in that corresponding details in our application.properties, Spring Boot will try to use that embedded database. So the thing is that configuration in the application.properties will take that higher precedence. So in that case, Spring Boot will check that corresponding configuration, we'll try to reach the corresponding database. There's a very simple way we can connect it, but in that application.properties we can provide that other mode configuration to control our data source that we have. I'm not going to that deep level on that corresponding data source configuration, but if we'll go to the Spring Boot documentation, you will see there are lots of data source configuration through which we can control that number of connection, waiting time, auto commit configuration, lots of things we can control through our property file. So next slide, we have to do one small hands-on to connect with our MySQL database. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Now we have to do one small hands-on about MySQL, how to connect with the MySQL database using our Spring Boot. See, this is our small application which we have used to connect with our embedded database. Now top of that database, what we have done, we have used that corresponding pom.xml. If you see our pom.xml, we have added the MySQL connector to connect with the MySQL database, and in our application.properties we have added that corresponding credential and database URL. These are simple two things we have added in our application. And now if we go to our sorry, yeah, what happened, yeah, if we go to our corresponding MySQL database, if we select it, so database is there. So I just tried to verify few things. Now if I check the truncate, database is there, but I am truncating the database. Now truncate database is truncated. If we see this, so nothing is there. So we have cleaned up the database. So this is our database. Now we have to do one thing. We have to start the application and we will check that database is coming into our database or not. So now let's start the application. Yes, start the Java application. Yeah, let's see the console. Yeah, data repository has started. Yeah, connection pool has been started. ORM 5.4.32 version is there, Hibernate. Entity manager factory has been initialized. Now the application is started. Now once the application is started, we have already few methods. If we see our controller, this is the get all employee, this is the populate employee. Just to first we have to check the corresponding populate employee to populate the initial database. Now now if we see the populate employee, sorry, this is not all. This is a populate database, populate employee. If we run this URL, this has given the message employee details are created successfully. Now if we go to our database and again run this query, we will see this. These 4 employee details has been populated initially. Now we have to see the get operation. Now if we see the get all employee are working or not, let's see. See, 1001 is there, 2 there, 3 and 4. 4 employees are there. These are in the database. Now on the database we have to create one specific employee. That is, let's say Sujita, 1010 Sujita. I want to add my name into the database. Now if we click on send the insert the data, run that service, if we see Sujita has been created as successfully. Now if we again run this application, Sujita should be there. Right. Now if we want to check that okay, Sujita is coming from the database or not, using the get employee details. Yes, now if we see this, see the details are also coming. So all things are working as it is the in-memory database. So here only the difference is the database is in our MySQL. So this is not the in-memory, this is the MySQL database. Now if we see a simple delete operation also, see this is the delete employee. Now it is taking one employee ID. Let's see if we go to our database. I want to delete my name 1010, because this service is taking the only the employee ID, right? Now if we go to our postman and if we see our delete employee, yeah, this is 100. Let's say I am giving 1010. Now if we send this employee 100 is deleted successfully. Let's see this. Yeah, that is not in the database. Even if I check through the get employee details, what is this? Yeah, get employee with, it should not return anything. Yeah, null, 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 null. So these are the basic operation which we can easily achieve through the Spring Boot without very less effort. Now if we just stop the application and if we again check the database, the data should be there, right? Yeah, data should be there. So even if we start the application again, data should also be there. Let's check quickly. So that is the basic difference between the in-memory database and that corresponding external database. Here the external database, we are providing the database credential and database URL, and top of that we are giving that one connector. If we use the DB2, if we need to provide the DB2 relevant details, if we use that Oracle, we need to provide the Oracle details. But here we have used a MySQL, so that is why we have added the dependency as MySQL connector and the database details in our application.properties. Now even if we see this is, yeah, so all have been persisted successfully, and so that's all to connect to the MySQL database. And now we have to check in the corresponding next slides that if we see that connection pool concept. So here we have used the Hikari pool. So now we can, this is the one important thing that we can think about, that we can use the different data source, different connection pooling. So how we can change that connection pooling? We have to check into that connection pool means the data source configuration in the next slide. So all things we can do into the properties file. So if we see our properties file, we have used a Spring, only we have used these three things, but we have a lots of properties, we can use it. Let's think about that. We can say that maximum connection we can configure. We can configure that waiting time, how much your application will wait to get one new connection, that we can configure. We can configure that whether my application will run through auto commit or not. So all things we can configure through our properties file, but we will not go to the details, but we will see that how we can change the data source configuration, and we will see through our application that we have to do in our. Now we have to see that how to change our data source configuration in our Spring Boot application. So as of now we have seen the on standard connection pool which is running with the Spring Boot server, that is Hikari CP. Means once the Spring Boot application will be integrated with Spring Data, the default connection pool or data source Spring Boot maintain is Hikari CP. So Spring Boot has the first preference on Hikari CP, but we have that option to change this data source to other data source. So what are the other supported data source are? The mentioned as a Tomcat, Commons DBCP2, Oracle's UCP, or standard Spring frameworks, simple driver data source, or H2 or PostgreSQL. So these are the data source Spring Boot supports, and we can switch between the data source based on our requirement. But we have to check how to change the data source configuration. We can change the data source configuration in two ways. One is that through auto configuration, another is the manual configuration. So auto configuration means we have to add that corresponding data source details in our pom.xml. Our Spring Boot application will scan the component and will configure automatically the corresponding data source in your application. But to top of that we can bypass that algorithm and we can add our specific corresponding data source in other application.properties. So what we need to do, we need to add the data source name against the key spring.datasource.type. We need to add the corresponding data source against that key, and Spring Boot application will take the highest priority on that key, the corresponding data source. So we have to check in our hands-on how to change that corresponding data source. Now we have to see that what are the dependency we need to add. So these are the changes we need to do in our application to change the data source. For the auto configuration, what we need to do, first we need to exclude the default data source. That is why exclusion criteria has been added on that Spring Boot starter JPM. If you see that com.jaxxr and the artifact ID Hikari CP has been excluded from the default. Now once it is excluded, we need to add that corresponding the desired data source in our dependency. That is the, if you see that data source here are, this is the corresponding data source we are using, yeah, Tomcat, and we are excluding this corresponding Hikari CP. So Hikari CP is excluded and Tomcat has been added. But if you think that okay, I don't need that, whatever the configuration in our pom.xml, I have to override in our through our application.properties. For that, what we need to do, we need to add that corresponding data source type. Data source type, this is the data source type, yeah, and this is the data source name. We have the example is for the Tomcat. But if you think that Oracle UCP, we need to find out that what are the corresponding Oracle UCP data source name. We can add it simply that corresponding value in the application.properties. So now we have to see in our example or Spring Boot application how we can change that corresponding data source name. Now we have to see the how to change the data source configuration in our existing Spring Boot application. So what we need to do, we have to first we have to go to our pom.xml. Yeah, if we go to our pom.xml, as of now if we see that existing configuration, so this is our Spring Boot starter JPA and this is a MySQL connector. So by default by default what Spring Boot does, Spring Boot takes care about the corresponding Hikari pool data source. Yeah, this has to also be commented. Yeah, we have to uncomment it later. Yeah, now let's start the application and we will see that what are the corresponding data source name by default. Yeah, the application is running. Yeah, see, this is the corresponding, if we see the console, the Hikari pool data source has been started. And what I have done to check the data source name, I have added in the service class. If we see our service class, this is our data source has been injected, this has been auto configured, and we have added one post construct method and I have printed the data source name. Okay, now if we see the console, that corresponding data source name is getting printed, Hikari data source Hikari pool 1. Now based on our requirement, it may happen that we need to change the data source, because end of the day data source is maintaining or configuring the number of connection timeout, auto commit, and lots of features. So we'll see how to change this default data source configuration from Hikari to Tomcat. So what we need to do first we need to go to our pom.xml. So first we need to exclude the default configuration. This is a manual configuration. So first we have to exclude the Hikari configuration. This is a exclusion logic in the Spring starter. Now we have to add the corresponding data source which I want. Here we have added the Tomcat configuration. Yes. Now let's stop the application, yeah, and start the application again. Yeah, start the application again. Yeah, let's see that what are the our expected is to get the Tomcat data source. See now the corresponding Hikari pool has not started, and if we see the data source name, yes, this data source name has been printed as Tomcat data source. And if you see that there are lots of configuration, default auto commit, default read only, transaction isolation, catalog, lots of things are there. So we can configure all of this configuration through our application.properties once we have to add that corresponding data source. Now this is the auto configuration. How to, let's think about that. If I think that okay, I don't need, or I don't want to maintain through the pom.xml, means here if we exclude it, if we keep it, let's say, yeah, if we exclude this, which, yeah, now if you see, if we do not exclude it, then what will happen? Though I have added that corresponding Tomcat JDBC, so now what will happen if we run that application? Which is expectation? The expectation is that that Hikari pool should be used, because the default data source configuration is the Hikari pool. So let's see. This is a quick win, and we should know once we have to work on the real life project, because sometimes we require to change the data source. See, now the data source name is the Hikari data source. So default data source is the Hikari pool. Now without changing in the pom.xml, how we can achieve to get the Tomcat data source? So what other way is to through the application.properties. In the application.properties, we can add the corresponding data source name through spring.datasource.type, and we can restart. We need to restart the server, and we will get the corresponding connection pool. Let's see that. Yeah, if we see this, this is the run as Java application. Let's see. Yeah, Hikari pool is not started, and the data source name is the Tomcat data source. So now I think you have understood how to change the data source configuration, and I wanted to show through that small hands-on. And so once we have to based on our requirement, always we can think about that, and we can change the data source if required. So that's all for this video. Thank you all.